Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled 5 Key Points to Consider in Design Transfer of MedTech. My name is Jessica Lyons. I'm the Operations and Enablement Guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenters, Doug Brown and Ted Trask, are really looking forward to sharing tips from their decades of real-world experience to help you put the necessary checkpoints in place to ensure a successful transfer of your medical product to full-scale manufacturing. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenters and their consultancies, Sunrise Labs and Citronics, I'm going to touch on a few items really quickly. So first of all, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total, and that will include Q&A at the end where Doug and Ted will kindly answer any questions from today's presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send those as we go. Also, if you at any point in time have any issues in terms of audio and video, please let us know through the questions as well. But I encourage you to submit those questions throughout the webinar. We will get to as many of them as time permits. In terms of this, we will also be sharing a full recording and slides with all the registrants of the webinar, so please keep an eye out for that email sometime later today. I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you who are tuning in now. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenters, Doug and Ted, as well as through our award-winning quality management software. For those of you who said you are interested in seeing how Greenlight Guru can help you handle nonconformances that arise during manufacturing, someone from our team will be reaching out to you after today's webinar to arrange for a personalized demo of our solution for your team. If you haven't connected with us yet, but you would like to, simply head on over to www.greenlight.guru after the webinar to schedule your free personalized demo and learn how we can help you manage nonconformances and more. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to meet other needs like market approval from FDA, compliance with EU MDR and IVDR, ISO 13485-2016 certification, as well as breeze through audits and push beyond baseline compliance to deliver true quality medical devices to patients. Now, on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to your co-presenters today and distinguished partners of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Doug Brown and Ted Trask. Doug Brown is the Director of Mechanical Engineering and Design Transfer for Sunrise Labs and has over 25 years experience in medical device, biotechnology, and mechanical system product development, focusing on mechanical design, plastics, and design transfer. As technical lead for development and launch of over 10 major new products, Doug is recognized as an innovative and award-winning product designer and has particular experience in development of systems that include high-volume disposables. He is an expert in sterilization processes, including gamma irradiation and ETO, and has deep relationships with local and North American molders and assembly firms. Doug holds several U.S. and international patents. Joining Doug as today's co-presenter is Ted Trask. Ted joined Citronics in 2008 with a background in military avionics and electronics manufacturing. As the Director of Corporate Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs, Ted provides overall company leadership and direction to create, monitor, and improve quality programs and reduce costs while meeting customer quality requirements. With respect to regulatory affairs, Ted's responsibilities include acting as liaison to and maintaining Citronics compliance with FDA, ISO, and other regulatory bodies. Along with senior leadership, Ted is involved in the ideation and development of broad regulatory strategies consistent with business objectives and regulatory requirements. This has included expanding certifications and registration in response to customer requirements. Without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenters, Doug and Ted.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a very nice lead in. And adding to a little bit on the bios that you mentioned on there for myself, I've been at Sunrise Labs since 2015. And so the number of projects launched is now far greater because Sunrise, being a design consulting and for hire design service firm, has a much higher, faster tempo than in the past when I would say at Abbott Labs or firms like that on there. The one thing I will say, we're all in this, and I assume the whole audience is in this, in that everything we develop and design, we have to transfer. You must transfer it to manufacturing in order to it to reach end users and be of any good. If you don't transfer it, it's all for naught. So we're going to move in and just talk about how relationships between, and it's really a three-way relationship, the relationship of the end customer, the contract manufacturer, and the design firm. That three-way dance, building that successful relationship really makes projects far more likely to be successful. And certainly, as we'll touch back on a theme often, when it's done early in development. So we're going to circle back to this top bullet on selecting a CM and they're in development. Key early on is delineating the roles. You have this three-way dance. Who is maintaining what? Who owns what? Who is defining what? And so Sunrise Labs has, and I'm sure there's a link somewhere on here or go to our website, we have a transfer guidance document that talks about how to successfully plan that relationship, as well as then once you're into transfer, a good checklist on executing it. And you'll see Ted and I will touch back on again. And by the way, I should mention, Ted and I have worked together on several projects and we've been through this rodeo together. So there's a strong comfort that the path between Sunrise and Citronics is well paved. Of all the contract manufacturers we use, Citronics and Sunrise have joined together on projects, probably the most on there. And so that communication relationship is, a key element to making this work. So circling into the selecting a CM, a lot of people ask, why is Sunrise trying to help a customer select a CM? Well, probably half, we're a design service firm, so we're up front in the design area, and probably half our customers come in and they already have a supply chain contract manufacturer. One thing that means, of course, is Sunrise has to be very nimble and responsive and able to work with anyone that we're introduced to. And that has really shaped our processes to be very flexible, which works great with a company like Citronics, as you'll see, because we're able to adapt so everything's in a format coming in for them. The early in development, I should say then, so for the other half of our customers are, hey, we need a contract manufacturer. Here's what we're thinking of the design. Can you recommend someone? So as we're getting into the alpha phase of a project and the design is starting to take a little bit of shape, that's when we're really asking the key questions of, all right, what makes a customer's product special? What is their special sauce, as we call it? Are they really electrically centric? Are they mechanical special and it's testing that needs in there? Is there something in optics that might drive it, or lasers? Is there some core technology? What is there special? And to that, it really is both technical and business aspects that are driving. So the technical I just mentioned, electrical, mechanical, testing, optics. Also in that technical comes in cleanliness and sterility, which would indicate different contract manufacturers, and volume comes in on that. But there's also the business aspect. Some of our customers are looking for a box build where they're really looking for the contract manufacturer to carry it through to the finished box that the user would experience, and to provide distribution and returns and possibly take on what I would consider virtual partner roles on that. So definitely a lot goes into selecting. And one that's really nice, we often reach out to a few CMs to talk through. And they've all been very open and honest, and it quickly relatively becomes clear who becomes a front runner. And that's one thing I really like on working with Citronics. You want to add anything on that, Ted?
Well, thank you, Doug. Yeah, I agree that it's that early engagement that really makes the key difference. It is a three-way role, and the more the three team members can communicate with each other about the plan, the timeline, and the requirements. And doing so as early as possible is definitely going to maximize the options that the customer has on bringing their product to market. Understanding who has the key responsibilities within each organization so that when questions are asked, when information is needed, when decisions need to be made, everybody knows who to go to get that question asked or answered, so that it minimizes the delays and it minimizes the confusion associated with multiple people being involved in the conversation. Sometimes documented agreements between the parties can be very, very helpful so that there's a very clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities of the various team members are. Uh, I'm sure everyone is familiar with using some form of a punch list of identifying what are the key issues that you have in front of you right now, and now assigning an actionee to those items so that they are being addressed in a parallel fashion with this project and not just a serial fashion. I will also add that the relationship between the three parties needs to be constant and it needs to be very effective. It cannot be transactional. The more that it moves into a transactional phase, the more the collaborative conversation between the three parties begins to break down. The time to market can be very, very critical for customers. And there are a lot of moving parts in this process of design transfer. Organizations such as Sunrise Labs and others that have these as their key strengths, partnering with organizations such as Sertronics to bring the core strengths of a contract manufacturer to bear can be very, very helpful to that customer by understanding what their options are, who's got the action items, and make sure that those issues are addressed in as timely a manner as possible.
Thank you, Ted. And I'll add to that, while it's a virtual world now and Zoom and Google Meets have really made our life easier, whenever possible, you cannot beat having boots on the ground, having the design engineers and the manufacturing engineers both looking at the product, looking at it together. It builds that communication, it builds that relationship. Go have lunch, have a beer. We can make it work remotely when we have to, and we do it all the time. I've been to China, deployed there for offshore ramp up, and so it's worth the trip, but it is worth, and again, that's one thing, as I said, the path is well worn between us and Sertronics and the other contract manufacturers that form our tight cadre, so we're able to build off of that. All right, our key theme in this first bullet is early in development. So my next slide is inherently busy. Most all of us in this business have encountered the FDA's waterfall development of phase development, where you have a research phase and a design phase and a verification validation phase, and then boom, you're into transfer. So taking a look at that, and maybe there's a lot of info on this slide, often projects go that, feasibility, user need, and then the big phase of design and development, and then verification, building our design verification units in clinical, and then boom, we're into transfer, time to transfer it to manufacturing, the fourth bullet to the right. And of course, Ted and team would take it and then ultimately do pilot, all their validations and building first lot to stock, and would have that punch list of all the beautiful information that they need on bill of material and specs. But transfer, while this is what you'll see in seminars and things like that, transfer really is not a monolithic event or phase by itself. There are numerous activity that really need to start back in development. So that blue aqua arrow that you see pointing back is the theme we want to talk about here. Yes, transfer is a series of actions that come later, but to get it ready, back by the time the design is really starting to formulate and is still malleable and changeable, you want to be selecting the contract manufacturer, and you want to be selecting the key circuit board manufacturers. What type of chip are you using? Who may be molding your product? Is it going to be a welded frame or sheet metal frame? All of that starts to congeal in the planning that's going on while it may not be happening in the research phase or the user needs phase, but by about there. Ted, you want to add anything on things that we do up front early together?
We do a lot of things up front together. I think probably the key at this particular stage of the conversation is just emphasizing that the sooner we engage in these conversations, the sooner we begin talking about these issues, the sooner we can resolve them or address them. I mean, everybody is familiar with lead time constraints and lead time concerns. And what this does is this changes the timeline so that a lot of these things can be addressed up front. And it removes some of the assumptions that these are lesser issues. And I'll talk about that in a little bit on the next slide.
Sounds good. And then you notice by beta, a strong recommendation that initial tooling and initial test equipment starts here. This could be for injection molding. Perhaps it's a single cavity. Perhaps it's a prototype level mold, or perhaps it's the bridge tooling we often do to get it going. And your printed circuit board ICT test, how are you going to test it? How are we going to inspect the circuit board? And also, now is the time to work through what is the final test going to be to approve or reject the end instrument or device. Because if you cannot reject the device, you cannot accept it. You need to have that defined clear and early, as well as now begin really looking with the bill of material. What are the long lead items, especially with everything we're encountering right now in the electronics world on
Absolutely.
there. So a lot of folks will say this is too early to be launching tooling. And I say it's a risk trade-off you need to do, because also you want the pedigree of your design hardware and your DV units and your clinical. Going into DV and clinical, yes, you can do it with 3D printed parts. You can do it with machined parts. But if your parts are a combination of molded parts and welded parts and sheet metal and circuit boards, the more reality that can be in those at that stage, the easier the transfer with Ted's team will go.
Absolutely. And if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about some of the risks that are associated with this. That's really what we're talking about here now. We're talking about identifying all of the major risks as well as a lot of the minor risks that not only affect the product quality and product function, but also address the business risks associated with this transfer process and meeting the timeline expected to bring that product to market. There's a transition activity where, again, as we just said, we bring these three parties together and talk about what that timeline is, what the plan is, and what needs to be done, and where things need to be pulled in on that timeline in order to meet that schedule. We definitely realize that one of the things that Sertronics as a contract manufacturer spends a lot of time and has developed even processes to address this is the transfer of information, the tribal knowledge. We know that there's a tremendous amount of information that's coming from the customer on their product, what their product's intended to do, the market that product will be used in, but it's also a lot of that information that's coming from the engineers, the designers, the folks that came up with the concept of this particular product. The earlier that we get involved in that conversation, the more that we talk about it, the more our language becomes the same language, and everybody knows what's going on. Part of our process in our T2M, or transition to manufacturing process, is this shoulder-to-shoulder collaboration with the design team and the customer team to make sure that when we begin the process of introducing that product into a manufacturing space, we are introducing it as if we were the production floor of that customer, so that there's no breakdowns in communication between the three parties. Also, we need to understand the risks associated with the materials and the components, whether that be raw materials that go into the product, or component level products, commercial off-the-shelf devices, or custom components that go into this particular product, and the relationships that may exist already on those parts. What are the lead times on these parts? Is there being sourced overseas, and is there a lead time associated with that? What's the understood or known component life cycle for these particular components? And while they may be working very well in the design at this particular moment, is there enough life cycle left in those parts that as this product goes into production, it's not going to interfere with the full life cycle of the end product?
Right. And Ted, just to add to that on the materials, you know, on a couple projects we've been through, something seeming as innocuous as the customer wants a different color in the material, and suddenly changing that colorant made the material no longer ISO 10993 biocompatibility approved. And
Correct.
that would have put us back into more testing in that area and would have added months to qualifying that material. So having that ability to work with the marketing folks up front, and we see the same thing again with, whether we're going with an FPGA or what is the core technology in the circuit board, what does that
Right.
mean on there? And if I can
We,
back up one moment to the tribal knowledge
yep,
that you mentioned, Ted, that's fascinating. Think about in the past year, a year ago right now, how many COVID detection devices came up across our path, and many of those all had some unique tribal knowledge, like a word, at the vendor
right,
who created it. It's 3 PhDs and a couple engineers, and they have a breakthrough idea on how to read it. And
right.
we had to try and tease out, could that actually be scaled up? Or was it so, scientifically driven by the engineers and PhDs and the magic drop of, special sauce that had to go on to it? And so that understanding that tribal knowledge, also for what risks it puts as well as what benefits it brings.
Yes, exactly. As you just mentioned, the color change, we've seen issues that can be as simple and mundane as going to a different supplier, but that supplier is a different plastic supplier, and the color of that plastic component needs to match the same color coming on a piece of sheet metal that's painted by a different supplier. So it can be something so seemingly minor that can dramatically affect the ability of taking that product to market. So I think one of the things that we really talk about in this risk mitigation phase is it's the things that you may think are not worthy of focusing on because they're so minor, but yet as you get closer to that product release or the production volume of that product, it now becomes a major issue that needs to be resolved and can really throw off the timeline. Um, the As you integrate the conversation with the contract manufacturers, such as ourselves, what are the process requirements that you have for that product? It may have been a wonderful product built on a bench by an engineer, and that it seemed perfectly fine that way. But is that design, is that manufacturability of that part, scalable to a production environment? What are going to be the process needs for that particular product? Resources, experience, training. Is there any special equipment or capabilities that are required? You mentioned lasers and optics. Are there special needs associated with those in order for the CM partner to be able to support that? You talked about the final inspection of the assembly, the controls, the inspection requirements, the test methodology, whether there's test at the PCBA level, subassembly level, and finished assembly level. Versus some people will have a test methodology approach of just doing a test on the final product. There's benefits to both. There's secondary processing involved, painting outside, sterilization, coatings that if any changes are made, you're now going back out to a secondary source to coordinate that activity as well. So these little nits, if you will, in risk mitigation, if they're addressed early, they can remain minor. If they are delayed or held off, now you get into the conversation of changes. So now you're making a change to the design, you're making a change to the supplier, you're making changes to materials, and those can be resolved. But what they're going to do is now they're going to be very disruptive later on in the process. So I definitely believe that partners working together to understand and address these risks as early as possible, and that early engagement with the team can help mitigate, minimize, or eliminate them from impacting the quality, the cost, and the time to market of the product.
Mm-hmm. And the change, as you mentioned, Ted, is a given. If we're going to engage with firms like Zertronics early in the design, the change will be higher at that point, and then less and less and less as you're progressing towards the true transfer. But that's one of the things that a good design firm and a good contract manufacturer will work out the rapid exchange of information and get that information in front of the contract manufacturer, even before we've committed to change, just get their assessment of what will this mean if we go this particular direction, because we'll still be learning in that early phase with all the testing and the, the philosophy of test early, fail early, learn, modify the design. That all feeds over to the contract manufacturer in our world.
Yes, correct. Yeah, we know that change is a fact of life. Change is going to happen. It's understanding that there can be significant benefit by bringing that change into the process as soon as possible, because the later those types of changes occur, the more costly they can be. You make a change to a material, it may be, straightforward, change this part number to that part number, but if material has already been cured, now you've got an excess and obsolete issue to deal with. So we know change is a fact of life, but addressing those changes and taking some of these actions to mitigate these risks might reduce the number of changes that occur early on in the phase of that product.
That's a good point, very good point. And that brings us to the DFX optimization. And the X, well, it's a small X on this, covers so many things from DFM, DFMA, the design for manufacturing and the design for manufacturing assembly, which are two key things. We work really close with the contract manufacturer from the earliest stages of the design. Is how are we going to assemble it, and are the parts manufacturable? And this can hit on so many areas. It's not just the injection molding of, do we have all of the gates and drafts and right, but if the device is a metal frame, are we going to weld that frame and it's box tubing, or is it a sheet metal frame? So there's that vector on how is it coming together. But we're really looking at, okay, how are the circuit boards coming in? How is all of the cabling coming in? How are the housings coming on to be able to continue the process, and really aiming for it to be error proof on the assembly with the contract manufacturer. The cabling, for example, on the circuit boards, we'll work with Certronics to make sure that we have all the test points in place, that we have all of the pick and place and everything meets for high speed on there. But we'll also be working the interconnect. For a lot of designs like an iPhone, when you look at it, a Rigiflex makes no sense, where the flexible portion of the boards fold up into origami, but that adds costs. Is that the right solution for this customer and this vendor on there? Testability is a huge part. It's not just the circuit board, although we certainly start there and are focused heavily on it, but if there's any motions, kinematics, if there's speeds and feeds, will the device meet it? And what is the testing that we want to be doing as we're progressing down the line to see that we're able to do it? And so I put testability in one of the DFX because you got to be able to design it to be testable at the right stages. You don't want to wait, and jump in on this, Ted, on your experience, you don't want to wait until the device is completely done and say, okay, now we're going to test everything.
Right. Yeah. This is a common conversation regarding the test activity associated with the various levels of the product and the cost associated with doing that testing. What we have found is testing at the lower levels, at the PCBA, at the subassembly level, and at the system level, is very beneficial, because once you start integrating that PCA or that subassembly into the unit for testing at the final level, not only do you introduce the risk to that top level assembly with any issues that may be prevalent at the lower level of the product, but you certainly introduce the added handling and disassembly or labor associated with tearing the unit back apart so that you can troubleshoot smaller assemblies. In a perfect world, you test the PCBA, and then the PCBA goes into a sub and you test that, and then that sub goes into the next level and you test that. And that way there, the higher confidence results in higher yields at the end of that process. Any of the issues that are associated at the lower level are addressed at the lower level. There's also the value that that's being done in the same facility, so that if you're identifying a problem at the top level of the product, it may be easier to relate that to issues observed at the lower level assemblies. So, for example, you're testing a full medical device system at the facility, and you encounter a particular type of failure, and the test team that's involved in working with that product is very familiar with that type of issue, and they know not only what PCA has that problem, but what component to go look at on that particular assembly. So there's a lot of benefit gained from being actively involved in the full test methodology of the product.
hmm And that touches on the next big two S's, serviceability. Serviceability is different than the DFMA to where Citronics has to assemble at the initial time. Here we're focused on what does a service technician. We just completed a plasma processing unit that was funded by Barter on there for company Velico, and we're allowed to talk about it. And a large aspect on that project was what filters and what maintenance needed to be done in the field. And so what needed to be taken out of the way. We've all seen it with a car when you work on a course. How often is it frustrating that you have to take half the engine apart to get at something that seems so likely to have been replaced? So we insist on a serviceability review as part of the transfer effort. What are the parts that need to be replaced on an ongoing basis? And do you have enough access? Is there tool access? Because it may be very different than when Citronics was originally assembling it. Now there's more things in the way. The tool may not have access. Your hand may not have access to reach in. Or you might be able to replug connectors in wrong that were once in correctly. So there's a term from Japan on poka-yoke of making it essentially error-proof or idiot-proof on there. I have no idea what the exact translation is, but it's a philosophy that needs to be embraced by both the contract manufacturer and the design firm, because the customer may not recognize the need for it. But I really like the back and forth we'll have, with Citronics, that they'll challenge us and we'll challenge them, even though neither one of us is likely to be doing the servicing. Have we thought about it sufficiently?
Exactly. Yeah. You and I, we've had conversations about something as simple as ingress protection for a particular product, and decisions made about, we're going to glue parts together, or we're going to use gasketing and hardware, or we're going to use ultrasonic welding. That will have an effect on the ability to service that product later on, whether that's product that's out in the field or even troubleshooting a product that has failed at the system level. So, and again, that ties back to that test methodology. Where you're doing testing before you take that product to a point where you can no longer take it back apart for the purposes of troubleshooting.
And that brings us to the sustainability, which is really something that's come on our radar screen. I would say, and for myself, in the last 5-10 years, and it's become a larger and larger part. And it's several aspects. There's the vector of, okay, you're looking at design. What do we believe is likely to go end of life before this product goes end of life? If you know you're using a particular chip on a circuit board, will the manufacturer support that long enough? Or are you signing yourself up for an ECO at a mid-product life change? Do you need dual source suppliers in some cases to be able to bridge through that and their risk? And then there's the vector that is on the environmental and regulatory side, which we see more and more. We're certainly trying to consume less plastics. We're trying to consume things that are more economically friendly. There are regulations around this. Medical waste is inherently expensive to get rid of. And so recently we had a customer looking to improve the use experience of their device by going to a thermoform tray and a peel off lid, and the device would be beautiful in there. And that's great. And that works well here in the US, but you're going to run in this case, they said they wanted to launch in Europe and they'd face a higher sustainability challenge on that. So we were really trying to work with them to reduce the number of parts. So there's both an electrical and a mechanical and an environmental regulatory aspect to sustainability.
Oh, absolutely. And it can even go further than that. You can have arrangements between the customer, the distribution organization, and the CM to say that, we're going to use packaging for, larger devices that is going to be recycled back to the organization and minimize some of the waste and cost associated with, large packaging to assure the quality of the product when it gets to the end customer. We have programs here for recycling and reusing materials in the packaging process to help minimize some of the costs associated with those products. So we shouldn't always consider that the packaging that's used to deliver the product is a consumable that can be thrown away. There's possibilities that maybe it can be reused, maybe it can be recycled. And certainly the interest in today's modern society is moving towards more recycling and reuse of such materials.
You bring up a good point there, Ted. Refurbishability of the instrument of, you know, we have a 3D printer here at work that their business model seems to be that we rotate it out and they send us a new one every few years for whatever upgrade they've made. So that fits all of those align, and it is a new day on sustainability. And all of these, of course, impact Ted's next topic on the supply chain and cost.
Absolutely. So isn't this a conversation of late? What's going on in the supply chain? Certainly having a good CM, a good design house that can work with you and designing a good supply chain strategy, or DFSC, if you will, to help deal with what you have to do. There's a lot of materials that are involved in this, and there's a lot of players associated with it. Good bill of material management. What is the bill of materials, and providing early access of that, the bill of material information to your partners. We find, believe it or not, that Excel is a wonderful tool for communicating bill of materials within our organization and others. Something as simple as that.
If I can jump in on that, Ted, that is a great point. Like here at Sunrise, we've found where we have to work with both customers who manufacture their own product, contract manufacturers, we've found that using our PDM system within our CAD to drive the overall BOM and making that real time available to both the customer and the contract manufacturer so they have access to it, and outputting it in an Excel format. So it's very, Citronics wants a flat BOM. Someone else wants an indented BOM. Someone wants the, vendor's part number as opposed to our part number to be predominant. We can rearrange that very easily. But the key thing in the bill of material is it needs to be timely between the partners.
Yes. And having the ability to review that bill of materials and understand what is on the bill of materials, bring up any questions. Who are the suppliers or manufacturer part numbers that have been identified on that bill of materials? Are there conformity requirements associated with the parts listed on the BOM? Is it RoHS 2, RoHS 3? What is the status of those parts? Having tools like Silicon Experts in-house to be able to go in and do research on parts and availability and conformity requirements can be huge. We find we use it quite frequently. We also need the ability to flow down requirements to the supply chain. So any of the requirements that the customer has for that particular product, a good example is traceability, where we need date code, lot code information for medical device customers for full traceability on those devices. Having that bill of materials can be very, very beneficial. And in the current climate that we're in right now, I'm sure that there might be some questions about how do we deal with these bill of materials issues, the supply chain issues. And certainly we tell our friends that provide that advanced visibility and material demand. The more we can see what your demand and your plan is for the parts, the more we can communicate that to the supply chain and get them prepared. And if they have the material, we can source the material. If they don't, we can get that information back to the customer so there's no surprises. Certainly give consideration to multi-sourcing. Sole source of components can be very problematic when that's the only thing that has been approved for the particular design. Even if another component can be reviewed and qualified, you've now got that delay of reviewing and qualifying that part to see if it's compatible in the design of the product. So that can be very, very beneficial to have more than one manufacturer part number on that bill of materials. Mm-hmm. And consider alternate suppliers. For some customers, due to risk aversion, they won't work with brokers, and that makes sense. But it certainly does limit the material availability. So what's going on in the supply chain right now, give that some consideration. What's your risk aversion? If you are interested in dealing with brokers, what do you consider a good broker? What are the brokers out there? So we have a number of broker suppliers that we work with that provide the process controls to make sure that we're not getting any counterfeit components. And furthermore, as the contract manufacturer, some of the things that we're bringing to bear with regard to the supply chain issues is we're constantly watching the market, watching what's going on with these parts. We have routine conversations with major distributors to make sure that we understand what's happening with parts and what they see happening with these components so that we can make all of our customers aware of these issues as soon as possible. Constantly communicating with the customers and the suppliers to make sure that their needs align with material availability. We can, purchase the material now, secure it for later. Having the ability to bring that material in-house and hold it for their build can make the difference. Provide bonding of that inventory and warehousing capability. Something as simple as having the space to put it, that we can buy material that's going end of life or hard to get material and have a place to put it, fit it within our inventory system.
I like on that, Ted, when you're talking the scalability of it, being able to have the material there. We've had many customers that their products, ramped up quite rapidly on there, and so having that in place. But another aspect of scalability that is great is making sure as we launch, test fixtures that we know when we would need to duplicate and have more of those, or when we're launching tooling, how much annual rate, when, again, working it backward, when we have to, but when does it make sense to scale up more of those? It's a very different situation when we're dealing in the ones, tens, hundreds than when we get into the thousands or tens of thousands on a product. But that's an aspect on the supply chain and trying to flow some of that testing downstream if we can as well.
Agreed. Knowing what the supply chain that the customer already has selected as they've been going through developing the product and developing the product design, and what can the Sunrise or other design facilities and contract manufacturers bring in, all of the resources that we have that we can bring to bear to help support the supply chain needs and scalability. More than once, we've seen cases where the customer has selected suppliers of components and it worked wonderful as they were doing the development of their product. But when they started to go into production and ramping up, that's when the supplier bows out. It's just too much volume for them to be able to handle. So it's understanding that question early on. Who have you selected already for your suppliers, and what suppliers do we have that we can bring in that we know can scale with the production ramp up that maybe the supplier that was selected at the prototype level might not be able to support.
That's a real good point, Ted, because I like the way we go back and forth and we say, okay, if we're bringing a supplier, is it already an approved supplier to Citronics? If not, why aren't we using one that's already pre-approved to Citronics? Yes, Sunrise can introduce, but we want to minimize the number of new suppliers that we introduce to a contract manufacturer, and we want to leverage your existing base as early in our prototyping as we can, so that knowledge base continues across as an existing supply chain. And to your point, we want to try and understand early the suppliers that the end customer is bringing to the party, that they're saying, nope, we have this great relationship with them, we want you to go.
Yeah, and that raises the point of what are the existing agreements that the customer may already have with members of the supply chain? Do they have current pricing agreements that can be instrumental to understanding quoting process for material? Do they have special licensing agreements with catalog items that when you go to look at the part that the customer is actually specified is not showing up in the catalog because they have that special licensing agreement, or should they? If you have a commercial off-the-shelf component or assembly that's part of the secret sauce of your product, you want to make sure that you lock that down so that going forward in production volume 2, 3, 5 years into the future, that part will still be available. You won't have that manufacturer of that particular item making that now obsolete, and now you're in a scramble to recover on whatever that particular part is, that you're locked in early on in the phase to make sure that part's going to be available for you, and it's going to be available at the cost and volume that you're going to need to support your production volume. Another topic, and this is one that we don't often talk about until it's really too late, really, and that is a function of shelf life. Usually when people think in terms of shelf life, they think of a consumable that has an expiration date and that's just easy enough to go out and buy more. But it's actually bigger than that. There are
Mm.
materials that go into the product that, the good example is sterile consumables, that there is a shelf life of that particular part that you also have to add that time that it can be included with the product when it's shipped. And there's a balance between the purchase of those consumable materials with the production volume so that you don't run into a situation where A, you run out, or B, you can now no longer ship those consumables because there's not enough life left in the shelf life of that product. We see this also with the warranty terms and materials. When you procure volume materials, that materials from that particular supplier has an associated warranty terms for those
Mm.
materials. And while the contract manufacturer can procure that material on your behalf, you can run into issues with if you decide to uh, send it back, or you have quality concerns or whatever it might be, you may already be past those particular warranty terms with that supplier if that process is too slow. Battery life, that's one that's coming up a lot,
Yeah.
where the products have some form of built-in batteries, and what is the shelf life remaining on the batteries that go with the product as well. So there's a lot of things to consider at the material level, and that may have a shelf life that isn't sold as a shelf life issue, but can become a shelf life issue as the product goes forward. And certainly figuring out what those parts are, designing that in, as well as the contract manufacturer helping out with determining what the quantities and the volumes and the relationships should be with the suppliers so that they don't become issues later on. So
And
I
as you,
would go ahead.
I was gonna say, as you say, Ted, on the shelf life where it's being driven by either, reagents or consumable kits that are embedded with the product that have shelf life, or the batteries where we've got a design that is tapping into the battery right from the beginning to do some maintenance, namely dropping. We often see, and you and I have worked through this, where the customer wants a guarantee to their end customer that they're selling it to, that they would have, say, a year's shelf life for
Exactly.
the device. And so it's working backwards, not only how long that 1 year, but how long is it in the distribution chain and warehoused? And then when does Sertronics need to finish that device? And then when does Sunrise need to approve the device so you can get it on order? And there's this whole almost like life cycle of the product
Exactly.
that you're
Yeah.
looking at to determine these key demarcation dates.
So again, this sounds repetitive, but it's that early engagement with the supply chain partners, with the service partners that can help identify what these lead time constraints are and explore what your sourcing options are. It can dramatically improve the situational awareness and reduce both material and business risks associated with bringing that product to market.
Mm-hmm. All right, and that brings us to knowing your strengths on there, which Ted and I will tag team on this one because it affects us so much. What do you want to keep in-house versus, and what are the strengths of the partners that are supplying this? So certainly we look at the end customer again, what is their special sauce? It may be very challenging to ramp up that technology they've done or replicate it even. And so you may want to focus that on that area.
Yeah. So again, we go back to that first slide, right? And what that relationship is, and what are the things that makes your product special, and what is your involvement in development of that product, and then what are you looking to for your resources outside of your own facility? So it's recognizing what the core strength is of the company that's bringing that product out, and what are the core competencies you're looking for from your design partner and your contract manufacturer. What are the specialities that they bring to the game, whether it's material and service support, design capabilities, as Doug, as you just went through some of the different things to consider, such as sustainability and so forth with regard to the design. What is the core strength of the suppliers? Are they local? Are they able to work with you on resolving issues, or are you looking more for a global reach and offshore suppliers?
Well, that's a good point on the vertical versus the decision to outsource or
Yeah,
offshore. And what is the disruptions that are going on right now are playing havoc. And of course, on a lot of the items like the plastic molded parts and stuff like that, they're tied predominantly to what is the cost of energy at that time. And so, is it labor centric or is it material centric in cost to try and decide what to keep at House, clearly we're an advocate that the more you can keep under your core control, the less variables you'll be facing in the long run.
Yep. Yeah, but it's also the awareness that the customer looking at what they have in their supply chain, their pool of resources that's available to them to resolve any of the issues that may arise, whether that issue be design or service capability or just cost reduction. Going out and partnering with organizations such as Sunrise and Certronics can help them increase the breadth and depth of that supply chain and resources that they have available to them to get some of these issues resolved as well. So there's that balance between what do you want to keep in your facility, what is your secret sauce, what is your specialty on your product that you're not comfortable or don't feel that you're ready to share yet with any other organization, but yet leveraging what you have as available capabilities with some of the resources that you can reach out to, such as Sunrise and Certronics, to really expand the scope of what you can do to work on these issues.
Mm-hmm. And the strength of the partners come in so much. Are we dealing with an ultra fine pitch grid array, an FPGA that is going to need three-dimensional inspection of every single connection, and the vendor has that capability? Are we dealing with something that's particularly challenging in Bluetooth, where we need the antenna to be, to certain specifications? Are we dealing with mechanical molding on parts where we're really pushing the limit somewhere? Certainly this gets in if you get into optics or if you get into devices that have mechanical constraints on it. And then as we mentioned again, the testing on there. If we're going to be flowing tests down to partners, is that something they do on a regular basis? Is something that's just normal part of them? And then the automated assembly, if the volumes are there, we've had one customer since I've been here who wanted 700,000 parts for launch, and so focusing early on automated assembly and that everything would fit automated assembly technology. That was a very different design constraint than making a few hundred to start.
Yeah, it's a serious conversation about fit. What do you have and what do you need? You just touched on a couple of the categories, the people, the equipment, the skills, the production footprint, the space that's needed to build that product, and of course the experience.
All right, that brings us to re-summarizing again our key takeaways. You've heard Ted and I talk that you need to build a successful relationship, and it needs to be a three-way relationship between the contract manufacturer, the end customer, all the suppliers to that contract manufacturer, and the design firm. But a takeaway on that also is get it going as early as you can. And then identify and mitigate risks early. Ted puts this well into perspective.
Yes, there's definitely business risks, there's technical risks, and the more you know about those, the more you talk about them, the more you have your partners identify and work to address those, whether it's tribal knowledge, raw materials, custom parts, supply chain issues, process requirements and controls. Again, it's all about identifying what they are and making sure you got the right people working to resolve those risk issues as early as possible.
In the DFX optimization, I view that more a culture as well as a process and checklists and reviews. It's a culture that you have to infuse between the contract manufacturer and the design team that's designing early, that they're going to focus, that every decision has to have that: how are we manufacturing it? How are we assembling it? How are we testing it? How are we servicing it? Is it sustainable on there? And so it really comes down to the right mix of analysis before you jump into the design. And then when Certronics builds it, we have an opportunity to really go. Ideally, the design engineers get to be, a little bit of a fly on the wall at a certain point, watching these early builds happen. And that's a great thing if we can get the technicians from the contract manufacturer involved as early as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Early involvement, even though we may not be at the phase where we're building the product yet, being able to, as I said, identify some of these issues and some of these concerns and have tangible conversations about what we can do to address those issues, whether it's fitment, color, alignment, component selection, design interaction, or PCBA into subassembly and so forth. Having that conversation early on allows us to at least get that opportunity to get in there and say, we can eliminate a production issue by a minor change here at this stage in the process.
And Ted can touch on and re-summarize again that it's not just that you have a supply chain, it's that you have a strategy around your supply chain.
Exactly. So, as I said, early access to the bill of materials, and even recognizing that on the early phase, the changes will probably occur to that bill of materials, allowing us to go through that laundry list of materials that are going into the product gives us the chance to begin to identify any potential risk factors associated with the components selected. Making sure that the suppliers that are selected in the build of that product have both the capability and the scalability to take that product to full production.
Mm-hmm. And that ties in with the identifying key strengths. We've reached out to contract manufacturers, including Citronics, where they've looked at the project and they said, nope, not us, for whatever reason on there.
Right.
It was some element. We appreciate that open and honest feedback early on. In most cases, it's a question of, okay, who would we be supplying? Who else would be feeding into to make it work on there? But identifying those strengths is one of these key takeaways. It has to be an open, honest, as everything is, but discussion early in the project of, is this the right technology at the right manufacturing base to get this done?
Right. As I said earlier, it's got to be really collaborative and not transactional. The more collaborative it is, the better it works. We like to think of ourselves as an extension of the customer. We are the production floor rather than thinking of another business dealing with a customer in the classic sense.
Great. All right. I believe at this point, Jessica's going to bring us into questions.
Absolutely. So, one, thank you, Doug and Ted, for a highly informative presentation. Anyone that we are unable to get to your questions today, don't worry, your questions will be shared with our panelists. They'll make sure that they follow up with you individually. And as a reminder, yes, this was recorded, and a copy of the presentation with the slides will be emailed to everyone later today. So from early on in this, this is a question directed directly to you, Ted. How often do you find yourself having to add specialty services internally to your organization to meet the needs of a customer? So precision optic alignment, clean room cell, et cetera.
It's not that often, but we are a very flexible organization and looking at what makes the best sense for Citronics and what makes the best sense for the customer. If it's something that is readily outsourced to an organization that is their core competency, certainly that's the direction that we're going to recommend. If it's something that's within our capability to bring in, but just there's not a lot of demand for at the moment, we always tell our customers we're more than willing to give that serious consideration and bring it in. That's how an organization grows. That's how we develop our capabilities. As you just heard Doug say, if it's something that's not our core competency, it's not within our ability, we're not going to sell something that we cannot do. So we will be straightforward and upfront with the customer and say, that's not at this moment a core competency of this organization, but we know a supplier that it is. We know someone that can help you with that particular need. Probably the most common one that comes up in conversation is conformal coating. So it's something that we've talked about many times about bringing in the organization, but because of the low demand on it, it's never been something that we needed to bring in. And we have an excellent partner that we work with that provides superior service with regard to conformal coating.
Awesome. I really appreciate that, Ted. So most customers, they want this transfer done quickly. Nobody wants the transfer to manufacturing to linger, but addressing all of the risks during transfer can extend the timeline. How do you prioritize risks that need addressed now versus some of the risks that maybe could be managed during production so that you could meet all of these critical timelines?
Well, as I said earlier, the key is knowing what they are. So early communication of those risks gives us the chance to talk about the best strategy to approach to alleviate those risks. Yes, sometimes the best strategy will be a modification or an adaptation in our manufacturing process to address that particular risk. Maybe it's going to, we're going to take it as a continuous improvement item within the organization and say we can become a better organization to all of our customers by taking on this capability that we don't currently have. But the reason that we want to have this conversation early is if we can identify that this is a particular risk that we cannot address later on in our process, it needs to be addressed now. You don't want to be finding that out when you have an expectation that we're going to be doing volume production of these units in 3 months. You want to find that out as soon as possible so that we can adapt, we can be flexible and figure out what we need to do in order to do that. Do we need to get with Doug and his team to do something with design? Do we need to talk to an outside supplier? Do we have more conversation about what we can do as the organization internally? But we want to understand what that risk may be and have that conversation as soon as possible so that we're not interrupting the planned timeline for that product by trying to scramble at the last minute.
Right. The classic example on that, Ted Encounter, is the when to release capital funds. A lot of customers are inherently, they want to wait till later to release capital funds for test equipment and injection molding or anything that is capital intensive, automation for assembly, for example, on there. And so we have to look at each one of those. In the case of injection molding, it's okay. Could we machine the part? Could we 3D print the part to start and get moving? Could we cast urethane the part to get started and allow injection molding? But recognizing that the fits will be different, the strengths will be slightly different. You have to assess, would this product be detrimentally impacted by those changes that you would see? And if not, then those are a very viable solution to get going. The flip side of that is many things you can't get the real properties until you get to injection molding. How the material flows is going to impact its strength and how much it can bend and deflect. And you want to insist then, you want to get it to molded sooner. The automated test equipment is the other one. Okay, well, what is the ramp up? It may be designed for automated assembly at some point, but you might be able to delay that, recognizing that you're going to be far more labor intensive. We did this at the last startup that I was at, Rapid Micro, where we started off very labor intensive on assembly, and we're able to, over time, reduce down the amount of labor it took to assemble once the confidence in the product had built up more.
Now,
Agreed.
Doug, go ahead, Ted.
No, I was just agreeing.
I'm actually really glad, Doug, that you brought that up. So when you start talking about maybe some different manufacturing methods or different options that you have to kind of get things up and running a little bit faster, it does bring a couple of other questions from the audience into mind. So what kinds of changes will make it hard to justify that a given unit is production equivalent versus an engineering prototype? And I think this is a key when you switch the manufacturing method, all of the testing that you've done. You mentioned specifically the strength, the tolerances. That can have a drastic impact on some of your design verifications and maybe what you're doing. There's biocompatibility challenges with shifting your manufacturing methods. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into consideration here.
You are correct on that. Material is first in top of the mind of clearly a 3D printed part may even be dimensionally the same, but it will never be the same material as a molded part. And the same thing goes on mechanisms and molded frames and parts that we put together. If you're not using the final material, you're inherently stepping away, but you just have to do a risk assessment on each one of those. For the particular needs of that client, it may be an acceptable risk on there. The circuit board and the componentry that's in on it, if you have to make some substitution, and Ted can jump in on this, that comes up on there. Again, I would be looking to see, have we changed the performance range of the product? Is there any product spec that we believe the real product would be able to meet that the prototype method couldn't meet, that would be a red flag that you're not product or production equivalent.
Yes, agreed. And we see frequently, changes made at the last minute, which, as I have already said, can be a bit disruptive. But one of the things that we recognized and introduced in our process, a T2M, or transition to manufacturing, which is that phase that says, as we bring this product into the manufacturing environment, let's test it and evaluate it in the context of what does it take to build the product. Let's make sure we do a controlled introduction into the production phase, rather than just dumping it into manufacturing and assuming that it's going to work. We want to put all the right eyes on it, the engineering team, to make sure that when we start building this product, that that material that was selected, that plastic, that sheet metal, that bronze, or whatever it may be that went into the assembly of the product, or the printed circuit board assembly, and the testing or the lack of testing that we have on that product. What are our recommendations, and what are the issues that we're seeing as we begin the process of introducing it to manufacturing? And again, some of these things you don't find out until the last minute. We know that that's going to happen, but it's doing this stuff as soon as possible, as frequently as possible, early on in the phase of that product introduction, that minimizes the disruption later on.
And this is a topic on, is it production equivalent? Does it meet design verification target? Or does it meet saleable target on there? And that question comes up all the time. Some of it will have to do on the QMS and quality system side of, if the customer feels that their prototype could be sold as is, did they do enough of the design development early on from QMS? Are there requirements? Were there hazards? Is everything traceable? Is there certifications for material? Is all that hanging together? Usually you can tell a prototype because that will be missing.
Right. Yeah, we've had conversations. Customers' medical device need full traceability on the products for the purposes of potential recall. And in the early design stage, the prototype stage, that's not as important. You're just trying to flesh out and verify functionality. But later on, the materials that you procure for building that product, especially in a production environment for a release product, you're going to need full traceability. So we know that there's going to be changes. There's going to be that prototype stage where that product is, the drawings are on a napkin at the moment. But as we progress through that process and we get closer to building units that are going to be released to production, now we need to tighten that down. We need to lock things down for traceability purposes, device history record purposes, so that the product that comes out of the facility, even on the low volume on the initial production phase, has the full traceability requirements to satisfy the FDA.
Yeah. And while Ted and I have been focused heavily on the electronics and mechanical, the physical aspects in the product, the same goes true for software and firmware on there. Is it the code that you're expecting to launch the product with, or is it some Arduino controller that the engineers have put together to get testing, and now you say you don't go launch it, and you're planning a major change that would impact electronics in it? Those are red flags that you're really at a prototype and you're not a product equivalent on there. And has any, what has been done on the software to prove it, to validate the software?
Yeah, I think some of the things that you guys mentioned, Doug and Ted, this is so important to understand documentation, and to never be afraid to start documenting something in a draft status. And if
Yep.
it turns out that what you did from a prototype standpoint, you like it, great. Hey, guess what? You've already documented it. You don't have to go back, but it doesn't have to be, official and published and released and, etched in stone, never able to be modified. So um, balancing that can be key to also helping you figure out if it is a production equivalent versus a prototype still. So always important to keep track from a documentation standpoint. One question, um, how do you handle differently a design transfer with a product undergoing active development versus something that's maybe a more tested, robust design? Can you talk about some of the different challenges you face? I guess maybe summarizing this for some others in the audience. Essentially, depending on when you start the design transfer process, or if it's something that is maybe something that's been an existing device that you're making just a couple of minor modifications and changes to?
I'll float a little bit on that. Is the majority of what we're engaged as an upfront design service firm is new product development, to where it's a significant change or a new product and it's viewed in the customer's view of a new product. We do help and support the on market one, but the transfer challenge that we're face the most common is trying to get it going early and recognizing that change is underway, and that it's a back and forth with the contract manufacturer during those early development. The more on-market proven product, where it's almost sustainability or a sustaining engineering effort, that you're making some improvement, often for cost reduction. I'll admit many times that is the drivers. They got it out on the market, everybody loves it, it costs too darn much, and they can't make profit on it. Those tend to be more a late stage transfer activity, because there's a product, there's a line already existing, there's tooling existing, there's something you're building off of, and you have to complete all your verification, validation, IQOQ, and you're really showing that this change is essentially blind to the end user or brings some new feature or low cost, but you're not revalidating the whole product.
Yep, and I would add that that's principally why I raised the concern regarding tribal knowledge. So there's this body of knowledge that goes with that product at each stage of its life cycle, and the further it is down the path of that life cycle, there's still that need for, what do you know about this product? What do you know about the issues with this product? What can we learn from you from this stage, whatever this stage of this product may be? And then begin the process of trying to understand what are the things that we have the flexibility to change, to make better, to improve upon, and what have we already gone past that milestone, and now the printed circuit board design is fixed. So there's going to be no further changes to the printed circuit board design, even though we may be experiencing manufacturability issues associated either with the printed circuit board or the assembly that it goes into. So again, that ties back very carefully to the collaboration that's going to occur with the parties involved, so that we can effectively communicate what have we identified as the issues. Again, it's identifying what those risk factors are. We see that there's the proximity of these components is too close. It's going to create a heat issue. It's going to create a potential damage issue, and communicate that back to the customer, so that if there is any consideration for changes to the design or alteration of the product to accommodate that condition that's been discovered, that can be done. But that's now, we're going to work with what we get when we get it. That's why we're trying to emphasize that the earlier we're involved in that conversation, we can go from a reactionary to a proactive approach. So can we be reactive? Yes. We would prefer to be proactive.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you guys have talked about during the Q&A is really focused around communication
Yes.
and how critical communication is throughout the entire stage. In terms of communication, and this is kind of a summary of all of these questions, what kinds of things do you want to know as you are starting to work with a new customer? What are some of the things that they should keep in mind when they're reaching out to a contract design firm, a contract manufacturer, as they communicate? How much is too much communication?
I would speak from the context of contract manufacturing that too much information is not enough. What we're trying to do is we've used the term collaborative, shoulder to shoulder. The more transactional, the more separated the 2 or 3 entities are, the more difficult it is to be successful for everybody. So the closer we are tied together, the more we're speaking the same language, the more information we have. What do we know about your product? What do we know about the processes required to build the product? What do we know about the design, design stage, your timeline, the status of your business? All of these pieces of information are critical to painting the full picture as to what that product is and what it's going to take to get that product to market. And the more we know, the more information we have that's on parity with the end customer is beneficial, because now we're all working to the same set of rules. We're all working with the same piece of information. So, at the risk of getting 100,000 emails, I would say that, always more information is better. We will do the same. We will have questions. We will provide a lot of questions back to the customer about a product that they may think there's no questions necessary, but we want to make sure that we clearly understand what is going on, what the state of that product is, and what the options are for making improvements.
All agree across the board on that, Ted, here. It's also the right time on when is the design at the right point that there's enough definition, that there's enough material for the contract manufacturer to weigh in on. So we'd be asking questions of the customer. I love, there's always a difference between, say, a startup firm and a mature firm who has launched products on there. I love going to events like M2D2 and Mass Device and things like that, and you meet and see the energy of the startup companies. And so often they come up with what looks like a ball of wires and some sensors hanging out, and it does something really fabulously cool. And their first question, who should make this? And I'll be like, well, we got some questions to ask on how mature is this technology. There are technology rankings you can do to try and assess, is this device mature enough to be, to go into design, or are you really still in research and feasibility phase? And if you're in that research and feasibility area still, those questions would pause you from trying to consume too much of the contract manufacturer's time. Correct. Because it's just too early on there. Some of the other questions that we want to know right off the bat again is the volume and volume ramp up on there that's expected. Now everyone has a hockey stick design on there, and that would be flat for a little while and then zoom, up we go. And we know some are real that takes off, but what are we really trying to work with the contract manufacturer to get ready for on there for design? And our Chief Technology Officer, Adam Jacobs, is great on asking questions on these, on the customers again, on how ready is their technology to go live? What risks does the core technology have? Is it fully baked, or is it still, in the oven on there? And this comes across from electronics and how well, do we have EMI issues that we're going to be encountering down the road? Are we suddenly going to be facing a shielding issue on there? If they don't know what IPX means, and they haven't thought through, what ingress protection do they need for the device? That's a clue that you need to dig a little bit more and to try and get this. So it really comes down to, if you can't flush out the requirements, it's probably still a little early to be engaged on how to make it.
I agree. Yeah, we're usually not getting involved until you've gone from the napkin to the paper.
Yeah. One thing I do want to add to that is when you are talking to a contract manufacturer or a contract design firm, to never assume that they know something about your design or about maybe previous experiences that you have. I worked at a contract manufacturer for a few years, and we had one customer who thought we all knew the experience that they had had with a previous design on some different pull strengths, and none of us did. They thought that they had communicated that information early on, but it was quite a surprise when we failed some testing and had to go back from a design verification test failure. It's never a fun one.
Yeah, and that's key. You used a key word there, and how can we as a team eliminate those surprises?
Okay. One last question that we have here in the chat. So if there are any other questions that the audience has, please feel free to continue to send those questions in. But the last one that I have here, any recommendations or strategies for instances wherein local or global supply chain is disrupted across everything, all available suppliers? Let's face it, I think every single person right now is having some fun with this. I don't know how many lead times I've seen that are at this point 52 weeks for getting chips and things like this. So lots of fun across the board here for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, how many people were predicting that we were going to have a supply chain issue with wood coming through the pandemic? I was driving into work this morning and hearing that there is semiconductor component shortages affecting Toyota and Ford. It's across the entire spectrum of the market. So there's no one easy answer to give in that regard with addressing the supply chain, other than some of the feedback that I provided earlier, which, having that visibility and working with that customer on what's going on in the supply chain, what can they provide, what is the components you need, what's the demand that you're looking at, what are the options that we have on the table that we can go look at as far as obtaining either that part or a comparable part, a part by another manufacturer that has either the exact same requirements or capabilities or is close, and what is the customer willing to do to look at that potential. Has the customer looked at the depth and breadth of other secondary sources, or looking at broker suppliers for components and their comfort level with going to those types of suppliers to get material? What are the testing requirements of those components before they'll accept them into their products? So there's a lot of things going on. It's probably the most common question that we get right now is related to supply chain and supply chain management. And that's why we continue to watch the market. We're on the phone with major distributors on a weekly basis to understand what's going on, what's changing, what is going to affect our current customers or potential customers with regard to changing in the material supply market. You know, after Fukushima, people are watching the weather as to what can happen in different regions, as to what can happen to their component supply. So you never know what's going to affect it. It's all about effective communication and frequent communication about what the parts are, what the issues are that you're dealing with, what your options are that you can use, and hopefully that you'll be able to find a workaround that will get you the components you need, whether it's through conventional distribution or some other source.
And to that, Ted, we see that even impacting upfront in the design right now with the lead time. So what you're addressing is the classic, you're in manufacturing and a component is no longer available, and you're already a validated product, and at times your options are just limited. But we're even seeing this happening up front in the design, where we want to begin transferring and begin building and start getting those clinical units ready to go. And oh my goodness, we have a 50-week lead on some electronic component on there, but the electrical engineers, and I see all of these, it looks like a bingo game going on, where all of a sudden the excitement that they figured out a way of using 3 of the components in a small circuit board change, but the design is still malleable because we haven't finished transferring it yet. And while 3 components to get the job done may not be as sleek as the one component they originally wanted, those 3 components have never had an issue on being procured. And so there's a de-risking of the supply chain going on with that just awareness of that hyper awareness we have right now on lead times.
Yeah, and so understanding what those components that you're experiencing that issue with, and constantly watching them. How many times have someone gone in to look and seen that there's a 15-week lead time on a part, and then go and contact the supplier and say, oh no, that's not 15 weeks anymore, now it's 30 weeks. So it's this constant effort to stay on top of this. And again, as you just illustrated, that there are other options, even just in procurement of material, but also looking at the design again to see, is there something we can do in the design that designs out a hard to get part and brings in components that are more readily accessible.
And you might have what I would consider boutique manufacturing, where, we had an instance where we were just getting something as simple as custom bent tubing and very small needles welded onto the bent tubing, and the lead time, just because the vendor base was busy. And so, okay, in the near term, we had to go to something that was more of a, boutique manual operation. In fact, in this case, to get through prototyping, we brought the challenge home and had one of our technicians make those parts. But it kept the prototype build going while we could work the longer term challenge.
Yeah, and those options are always available. It's just the question is, now are you reaching a point where you need scalability, and that option worked well at low volume, but it's not going to work well at high volume.
And the cost. Cost of goods sold is always a question, always a debate on all of these questions. There may be times where a customer is willing to take a hit in the short term in order to keep
Yeah,
product moving or to get a launch date to occur. Because as we say on all products, we don't know it yet. The launch date, often gets pushed by factors beyond everyone's control, and you're working to mitigate that. But beyond any of our control, the end date of all products tends to be set by, factors none of us know, but that day will come. So the sooner you get the product out to market, the longer its life on market will be, and the more you'll begin that ramp up on revenue. And so there are times where a short-term, more expensive solution to keep moving is a well worthwhile trade.
agreed.
As you guys had mentioned earlier, de-risking by identifying multiple suppliers, or what you brought in now in terms of Doug, finding creative ways to maybe have less risky parts do this, or bringing things in-house, are all great ways to deal with supply chain issues, depending on where you are in that process. Very last question that we have time for: how do you deal with issues that come up when a notified body brings up issues that weren't considered in design?
Well, thankfully, we haven't had one of those issues yet. But again, this is one where effective communication, this is one of those little nits, if you will, that we try to exercise out of the customer during that early engagement is, who have you selected as your NRTL? Who they're going to be coming into our facility and conducting audits of your product. Do we have your identified critical component list? That critical component list and verifying the conformity requirements of those components when we purchase those materials gives us that opportunity to flag if there's any ECO changes or any changes from the supplier with regard to that particular commodity, so that we can bring that information back to the customer. So once you've gone through that testing and verification and validation of that design, and you've got that NRTL mark on the product, now there's a strict control to make sure you maintain that conformity. So having a good partner that's watching out for that on behalf of the customer, being mindful of not only what the auditors are looking for when they come in, but changes to the material, changes to the market with regard to those components, and even sometimes helping the customer protect themselves so that they don't cut in an ECO that changes a component that's on that critical component list that will cause an issue with the NRTL audits in the future.
Right. We try and encourage pre-screening. So like emissions is a classic one on NRTL testing. We try and encourage pre-screening as soon as possible, so we're not getting to the final test of the project and suddenly the NRTL is saying you don't pass emissions. It happens. And also having thought through what you're going to do if that case, but getting through a pre-screen early. This can also affect things like the usability of the product, that things that may have been inadvertently missed in a formative or summative. And so being able to react quickly with, is there a, labeling for instructions and training that can get you a little bit of time while you improve, so you're not delayed getting on market. The NRTL can find issues not just in componentry across the board, but they certainly serve a great function. But the key thing we find is they shouldn't be running the test for the first time when you're at the NRTL. They should be running it with you already having exceptionally high confidence that it's a pass.